Tonight, we are very fortunate to have award-winning Chris Costa, a multimedia journalist and anchor at CENTER Maine. Chris returned to Maine after about a year and a half at KHOU Channel 11 in Houston, Texas. He became one of the lead reporters on the COVID-19 pandemic and learned very quickly about hospital operations, public health surveillance, and epidemiology. Please join me in welcoming Chris.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And now, welcome back to Maine, Dr. Nirav Shah, medical doctor, lawyer, economist, leader, and most importantly, our trusted friend. You brought comfort and safety to all of us with your decisions, management, and briefings. So many of us tuned in daily to listen to your concerns and advice. The results spoke for themselves. I believe that Maine turned out to be the safest state in the entire United States during COVID, and we all know that was because of your leadership. Please join me in welcoming Nirav Shah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. Let me just say right at the top how great it is to be back home. Not just home, but home with my fellow Mainers. I know that October was a tough month, and November is going to be better, and December is going to be better after that, and next year is going to be better. I'm not going to sit here today and just tell you to look on the bright side. What I am going to do is tell you that I'm here to be on your side, and things are going to get better, and I'm glad to be back here with everyone tonight. So, on to the topic at hand.
Yeah. Obviously, we're here to talk about climate change and as it relates to public health. And Dr. Shah, I think this is something that when Tom approached me to talk to you about this, I was a little bit surprised because I didn't realize that these two topics intersected as much as they did.
You're exactly right, Chris. I mean, there's so many dimensions of climate change. Climate change can impact our economy through increased costs. It can impact our infrastructure. It can have deleterious effects on our wildlife, our food supply. But a lot of research has shown that one of the ways to galvanize people toward action, an effective way to galvanize people toward action on climate change, is to cast climate change in terms of its health impacts. So we're going to talk about tonight. And there are widespread and numerous health impacts globally as well as here in Maine. They range from everything from high heat to challenges with our food supply, to more infectious diseases, and everything in between. And we'll get into some of those. But the reason that I think this nexus is important is that, one, it's poignant, it's timely, it's right now. But the other is that from an action perspective, casting these issues of climate change in terms of what they mean for us now and what they will mean for our lives in the future is a very effective way to focus the mind on where we need to be going.
Let's start, because as you mentioned, there are many ways in which climate change impacts public health. Is there one particular one that you want to start with? Because we have a lot of options.
We have a lot of options. We're spoiled for choice, unfortunately. So let's start with heat. And I know that might sound a little odd to talk about the threat of high heat in Maine, especially when it's in the 40s right now. So I'm going to acknowledge right at the top, that's a little bit odd, and that just points to why galvanizing folks toward action is very difficult. But Maine has unique challenges with respect to heat. So let's first just talk a little bit about what the numbers are. Since 1970 in Maine, which is about the average age of most folks in this room, thereabouts. The average temperature in Portland has gone up 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit.
Average.
The average temperature. Now you might say, well, that's not that bad. That's the difference between a 60-degree day and a 62-degree day. What's the big deal there? Well, the fact is that it's not just the averages. And one of the themes we're going to come back to tonight over and over again is that when you think about climate change, you have to avoid being seduced by the mean. It's not the average that gets you. It's the extremes that get you. And one of the managerial challenges in general in the world is understanding situations where it's the average that you need to care about versus the extremes that you need to care about. And with climate change in particular, the average belies the fact that it's the extremes that are getting more and more extreme. So when we look at heat, just in Portland, the number of days per year that are considered to be unsafe for us here in Maine, when you go back to the 1970s, which again was a long time ago for most of you, when you go back to the 1970s, there were about 30 or so days per year that were considered to be a little bit unsafe. But now it's almost 50 days. So it's the extremes that are going to get us. Now, for the younger folks in the crowd, meaning the under 90 crowd, quick show of hands, who's in that group? Right. So here's the bottom line when it comes to heat. This past summer was the hottest summer of my life, but the coldest summer of your life. Right? So if you're a younger person in the audience, right, in your 90s and your hundreds, this past summer was undoubtedly the hottest one that most of us have experienced. But it's still the coldest one that many of you will experience for the rest of your lives. Wow. So when we think about climate change, we can't just talk about the effects today, we've also got to think about the effects in the future.
And it's remarkable for me to hear you say this because so often when we're talking about public health and epidemiology, we are talking about the trend and ignoring the outliers, but it is these extremes that are actually driving part of the concern.
That is exactly right, Chris. And different authors call this different things. Some people call it the black swan problem. There's different ways to think about it. But the fundamental challenge is that it's easy to get seduced by the mean. Mm-hmm. And something that those who are skeptical about the impact of climate change will seize upon is, oh, well, what's the big deal with 1.5 degrees Celsius over the next 20 or 30 years? How bad could that be? And what you realize is that in a complex system like climate, with so many interconnections, every 1/10 of a degree increase has effects that we don't even begin to understand. And that's why the heat challenge is a particularly poignant one. It's only going to get hotter. Now, when you add on to that some of the sociodynamic or infrastructure realities in Maine, the problem becomes even more acute. For example, Maine has very old housing stock. And it has housing stock that is designed not to keep the cold air in, but to keep hot air in and cold air out. We also have lower than average rates of air conditioning. Right. Average household in the United States, about 89 to 90% of them have air conditioning. It's only about 70% in Maine. We also have a ever so slightly older than average population, as I was joking about, but there was a reason I indicated that, which is that unfortunately the impact of a lot of the climate issues we're going to talk about tonight are disproportionately borne by those who can cope with them the least, the very young, the older folks. And so yet another reason why, even though it doesn't seem like tonight heat is something that we're concerned about, in the future, especially in the summers, it will be.
And you know, as we've seen, there are a lot of school districts across the state that they don't have air conditioning. There are those days early on, right here, where those days early on, sometimes it's too hot to keep kids in class because they simply don't have air conditioning, or towards the end of the season as well. Why don't we dial down specifically to Maine? How is it a climate change affecting the health of Mainers?
Yes, so we talked a little bit about heat. I want to zero in on everyone's other favorite infectious disease, and that is Lyme disease. Yeah. Lyme disease is a good case study for the way in which climate change will continue to affect people in Maine. So as folks know, Lyme disease is carried by a tick, the deer tick. And I don't know about you all, but it just seems like in recent years, it has exploded across Maine. And if you feel that way, your perception is not wrong. It is in fact the case. Data from the Maine CDC, the best public health organization in the United States, if I may say so. Those data bear out the fact that just in the past few years, Lyme disease diagnoses in Maine have gone up significantly. And like a lot of diseases, what we know to be diagnosed is only the tip of the iceberg. Right. So what's going on there? And what's the link to climate change? Well, part of the increase for tick populations exploding in Maine is just that there are more deer in Maine. But climate plays a big role. The summers are changing in Maine. They are earlier, they're lasting longer, and thus more people are in contact with ticks who feed on our blood. That is great news for ticks. It is terrible news for us. Right. And it's not surprising that as the number of ticks has increased and the season in which they are active, longer summers, earlier summers, milder winters, which allow them to thrive, it's no surprise that the increased number of ticks, the greater season, the more contact between humans and ticks has led to more and more cases of Lyme disease. Now, it's not just Lyme disease. I use that as an example, but what I want folks to think about when you think about the link between infectious diseases and climate change is to think of three categories of disease, or three categories of things. The first are current diseases in Maine that will be made worse by climate change. Lyme disease is a good example. The second category are diseases elsewhere in the United States that may find themselves in Maine because of the increase in warming temperatures. Right? This includes a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. And then the third category, the thing that really keeps me up at night, are brand new diseases that may come out of a jungle in a far and distant place and find themselves on the shores of the United States and thus on the shores of Maine. So we think about all three of these categories of things at the CDC, but it's really that last category, the new diseases that we don't even know about right now that keeps me up. Now, a lot of people ask me, how do you sleep at night, Nirav? And the answer is, I sleep like a baby. Which is to say, I wake up every hour crying and screaming about something. And one of the things that keeps me up at night is the threat of a brand new disease that we don't even know about finding its way to our shores. We'll come back to that in a bit, Chris.
Without getting too much into the kind of the speculation and looking into the crystal ball, is that phrase you've used so often during the pandemic. What type of threats do you think we're facing in terms of the magnitude? Are we talking about small things or are we talking about big things?
Good. So as I think in my world, when I think about threats, I think about two categories of threats. Threats that are low likelihood but very high magnitude. Those are the extremes, right? Those are once in a generation pandemics. And then I also think about high likelihood, low magnitude threats. Things that are going to find their way here and that they're just going to be more of a nuisance concern, but a nuisance all the same. Things like West Nile virus, right? The things that keep me up at night in particular are that first category, the black swans. The things that we don't even know about, that are out there and that could find our way to our shores. So you asked what the magnitude of those threats is. The answer is unfortunately that it's high. Okay. And it's high for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't know what they are. And so our system at the CDC, our system nationally, has to be ready to spot those threats and then respond to them. Now, I'm going to try to inject optimism tonight as we go through, even though it's important. It's important for reasons we'll talk about when we talk about communications. Because one of the things that we have an opportunity to seize on with respect to these new emerging diseases is to rethink the way that we design countermeasures, be they vaccines, treatments, and diagnostic tests. If you think about COVID, we went from diagnosing and spotting COVID to having a vaccine in around 11 months. It's not bad. It's the fastest of its kind. But 11 months is not going to cut it for the diseases that we may be thinking about in the future. So what that points to is a policy opportunity to create a nucleus of R&D, a unit within the United States government that is uniquely focused on bringing together all the tools of vaccine development in one place, under one roof, the research, the scientists, the regulatory apparatus. And our goal is to try to get from identification to countermeasure, not in 11 months, but around 100 days. So there is work being done to get toward that. So I don't want to leave folks with the impression tonight that all hope is lost. If doom is a foregone conclusion, then motivating toward action is almost a non-starter. Hope is very much possible here, and there are efforts underway to get us there.
Before we move on to the next question, can I just ask you what it means to you to be in the leadership role that you're in, observing that process play out?
Thank you for asking that, Chris. It's really, first, important, but also really exciting. You know, the CDC is at the cusp, at the forefront of thinking through these issues. And one of the initiatives that I am leading at the CDC is something that goes by the fancy name of pathogen prioritization. Okay. It's a fancy $5 word for the 10-cent idea of, hey, what are you worried about? And that's what we're focused on at the CDC. There are innumerable things out there that we could be worried about. So what we've done is to take that innumerable list and try to distill it to the things that we think are the highest magnitude, highest likelihood, most likely to emerge ecologically, and then start planning around that. It starts with diagnostic tests. Do we have the ability to create tests now rather than in the moment that we need them? Then, can we work with our other counterparts elsewhere to create vaccines, at least candidate vaccines that we can have on ice, so we don't need 11 months, but we need closer to 100 days. And then finally, how can the CDC be better at responding to those threats when they emerge in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia? Mm-hmm. We have teams at the ready that can deploy within about 72 hours to set up mobile laboratories, as we did in Equatorial Guinea over the summer, with an outbreak of a terrible disease called Marburg virus. We were on the ground within 72 hours and had a mobile lab set up within 7 days. But that's difficult to do, and it requires advanced planning.
Wow. You've talked specifically about some optimism, some hope. That we, I think, talk a lot about the challenges around climate change and combating it. In your mind, what can the average person do to improve the situation? Great.
Individual action is important. And let me situate or contextualize the nature of the challenge. Climate change is a scientific challenge that is enveloped in a communications challenge that is fundamentally a management challenge. Okay. So that's the levels on which I think about climate change and health. First is the science. There's a lot of science going on. Some of it we've referenced already tonight. The communication piece is important, and we're going to come back to that in a bit. And then fundamentally, climate change is about management. It's about prioritizing, it's about executing on the plan, and it's about making sure we're getting better every single day. So what can all of us do collectively? Well, there are concrete steps that folks can take in their lives. The challenge with climate change is that they're hard. And in some instances, they are dissonant with our everyday lives. All of us took a vehicle here to get here tonight, right? You drove to talk on climate change. A necessary thing, but ironic. I don't have a better solution for you. We took a car here. But change is difficult. And so recognizing some of these ironies, these discordancies, is the first step. But all that said, you ask what folks can do. Yeah. So first is that you can take concrete steps in your own lives. To the extent you can yourself decarbonize or move toward electrification, that's a really concrete thing. Okay. Right? All of our homes rely on different degrees on fossil fuels. I'm not suggesting we drop that to zero immediately. Right. Indeed, even if we did drop that to zero, the lingering carbon dioxide in the environment would still contribute to climate change for some time to come. But there are steps. So on the menu of things that we can do, the main course is moving toward electrification where possible. Some of that may be with vehicles, some of it may be with cooking appliances, some of it may be with heating and cooling units. But electrification is one of the more concrete things that we can collectively do to reduce carbon. The second thing we can all do is advocate. I said a moment ago that these are fundamentally management challenges. And thus, we need to advocate to our leaders to make sure that they are prioritizing the import of climate change.
I think sometimes when you try to boil it down to the single person, it can feel overwhelming. The amount of an obstacle in the way of climate change, and feeling like one small action might not be enough. You know, somebody who says, "Hey, I've become very diligent about composting instead of throwing food in the trash, and being really cognizant about my recycling." You know, can you help put that in context for people of, is that sufficient if one person or another person does it?
I definitely understand your question, and let me answer in this way. Sufficiency is a difficult thing here, and I don't think we should think about these things in terms of sufficiency, because what that leads to, and I've seen it, is invariably some degree of climate shaming. Right? And so what I think is important is not so much the question of am I doing things that are sufficient? It's simply, are there more and different things that I could do right now? And avoiding the instinct or the urge to say, well, you know, we have an electric car, they don't, so we're clearly morally superior. I think that instinct is one that we see a lot, unfortunately.
If you could just pass a message along to Keith Carson.
Yes, I may or may not have been thinking about Keith. And I'm told he has an electric car. I didn't know that, did you? Who knew?
No,
Who knew?
Never would have known.
Never would have known. How do you know within 5 minutes of whether Keith Carson has an electric car? He'll tell you. So individual action is possible, but again, let's not again get trapped in this.
Right.
Oh, am I doing more than my neighbor? Let's see what we can do collectively. Each of us is going to be able to contribute different things in different ways. The goal here again is electrification. There are other things. For some folks, that entails eating less meat. For some folks, it entails more cycling. A lot of different things we can all do. What matters to me more is that everyone is doing something, rather than all of us having a barometer against which we're measuring others.
Well, and then to that point, right, a lot of that discussion around climate change kind of shifts to, well, it's not so much me and my personal responsibility, it should be these big corporations that are cranking out tons of product, that are producing tons of carbon. There should be some type of regulation. So you're talking about advocacy and advocating for how much does that play into the actual effect of reducing carbon?
A large extent of it. It entails not so much individual action, but collective action, particularly with respect to the major sources of carbon dioxide. Now, I know that everyone's favorite bugaboo is the corporation that they don't like. And make no mistake, I mean, everyone wants something to change so long as nothing in their life changes. And with respect to corporations, we all want something to change, particularly if it's the corporation that we don't care for. Totally understood. Unfortunately, those challenges are not so easy. Those trade-offs are not so easy. Moving away from carbon and CO2 toward things like electrification requires a significant financial investment for everybody. Governments, individuals, corporations, et cetera. Regulation is undoubtedly important. There is no getting around that. And particularly as we think about a future where things are worse rather than better, increasing regulation will undoubtedly be a part of the equation. But how we go about that, it's got to be done thoughtfully.
Right, because of all of the ripple effects economically for how that all plays out.
Yes, and I'm not suggesting we elevate economic issues above climate issues, by no means. But we need to at least reckon with the fact that there's a trade-off to be made there. And usually in this world of complex systems, simple solutions are usually neither. Simple solutions are usually neither. And we have now decades of experience with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where very simple command and control mechanisms often led to unfortunate side effects that were unforeseen. Let me give you a very interesting example that's been written about and studied by a lot of economists. A number of countries in other parts of the world that were in the 80s and 90s grappling with really bad air pollution, really bad. Mexico City is the one that I've read most about. Had a great novel idea. Hey, you know what? If your license plate ends on an odd number on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you don't get to drive. And if it ends on an even number on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, you don't get to drive. Easy, right? You reduce the amount of cars on the road by half. You'll drop air pollution dramatically, right? Did it work? No. What did people do instead? Well, they can't not drive.
Right.
A lot of folks need to get to where they need to go to work. And so what happened a lot was people bought old beater cars, which are actually worse for the environment. The amount of traffic on the road didn't change. The Mexican government lost the revenue from those registrations because they were all under the table. And if anything, traffic and pollution went up. So again, simple solutions to complex problems are usually neither.
Which leads to the next point, right? This sounds like such a daunting task. What skills do we need to help us get there?
Fundamentally, in my book, the solutions to this climate change and public health nexus are fundamentally about management and leadership. The scientific principles that we need to apply, decarbonization, it's cleaner energy, more renewable sources, a more resilient grid, better medical countermeasures, those scientific principles are very well inked at this point. The fiscal challenges are very pressing, but fundamentally what this requires is leadership and management. Leadership is basically about knowing what to do, and management is about then doing that well. And where we need to be as a country, as a state, is a state where leadership and management prioritize climate change. They already do. I want to be very clear.
Right.
Very, very clear. Governor Mills is to be commended. Indeed, the name of her climate plan is Maine Won't Wait, right? So we're on it here in Maine. But that sort of leadership and management nationally, as well as on a continued basis in Maine, is really, in my book, the most essential skill or key that's going to be needed to continue making inroads. The reason is that we've already hinted at this, but just to put labels on it, in broad picture terms, there are three strategies that we need to be employing to deal with climate change. One is mitigation. That's reducing our carbon footprint. Number two is adaptation, being ready to deal with the impacts of climate change when they occur. Better seawall protection from rising seawater levels, better protection against rain and torrential flooding, et cetera. And then number three is innovation, creating the conditions under which these vaccines can be developed and deployed more quickly. Mitigation, adaptation, and innovation. All three of those are fundamentally political and fundamentally entail and require leadership and management.
And when you talk about leadership and management, it makes me think back to the kind of the beginning of the conversation where those big three threats are the ones that are already here, the ones that can come here, and the ones we don't know that exist yet.
Don't know about.
So am I understanding you to say that, and this sounds so simple, right? If everybody's on the same page, we get a bigger impact in terms of mitigating the crisis.
100%, 100%. I mean, climate change is going to be something that impacts, that can fundamentally transform and impact the way that all of us live our lives.
The state lines, the border doesn't...
Immaterial.
Right.
Immaterial. And so no matter what your profession is, no matter where you live, there will be a distinct impact from climate change. We've already seen it, right? I mean, we've already experienced it in Maine, right? The smoke from Canadian wildfires, the higher than average torrential rains, the higher than average temperatures. We're already experiencing it. The other piece that Maine needs to be ready for is that right now, the impact of climate change on Maine is comparatively lower than it is in other states. Texas, Florida, Arizona, Southern California, Louisiana, absolutely bearing the brunt of climate change impact right now. But that can lead to a false sense of complacency. We could sit back and say, hey, we've got time. But we don't have time, right? You don't want to be exchanging business cards in the midst of an emergency. Right. You want to be preparing now rather than later. If for no other reason, then many of those states will at some point become uninhabitable or uninsurable, which will then make them uninhabitable. One way or another, folks are coming to Maine from those parts of the country. Whether we like it or not, folks are coming here. We can either prepare and be ready for it, or we can not prepare and then have to deal with the consequences in the moment.
It makes me think too when you were talking about just some of the other kind of like weather effects. You're talking about torrential rains. We saw over the summer. I'm sure many of you remember that there were roads that were washed out.
Yep.
It then ends up tying back into the public health aspect of this if the climate change is preventing us from getting the health care we need.
Exactly right. I mean, so there are first order effects of climate change on health. We've talked about those: heat, infectious diseases, things like that. But then there are these second-order effects. Yeah. If the seafood industry in Maine becomes non-viable because of temperatures of Casco Bay and the ocean rising, first of all, that impacts our food supply. But that also impacts the economic livelihoods of so many people in Maine. That in and of itself, in a sense, is a public health challenge. Those folks are going to be struggling in a state that's already struggling with food insecurity. Right? If the roads are not, our infrastructure is challenged by washouts, what does that mean for our interconnectedness in the setting of an emergency? So these second-order impacts, I venture to say that we don't even have a catalog of them yet. And we're not going to, and really until they happen. So we've got to start thinking about that now. And some of it could be stuff out of science fiction, which is all the more reason for us to be talking about these things today.
You know, when you and I were preparing for this, the term that I ran by you, and I'm glad that you talked me out of it, was social determinants of health. And it sounds like that ties in here.
It does. And I didn't talk you out of it so much as that, you know, $5 word or a 5-cent word will do. And what, you know, and the idea is that where you live, what your zip code is, has a big impact on your life. It has an impact on how many doctors you've got around you, how easy it is to drive to work, how much that's going to cost you, and in many instances, as we think about climate change, what kind of access to services you're going to have. And so it's not so much about all of us, it's about everyone else out there. This gets to the idea of equity in climate change work. Equity is already a core part of public health in general, but it's particularly important with climate change. Equity is an opportunity to show off the breadth of what we can do. Some of the scientific issues are a chance to show off the depth, but equity is our chance to show off the depth of what we do. And when it comes to climate change, those who are the least able to cope will be the ones who suffer the most. If your home is already poorly insulated, it's going to be sweltering in the summer. If it's already tough for you to get to work, it's going to be tougher when the bridge is out. If your livelihood depends on the ocean staying at a certain temperature, then you are particularly vulnerable when that doesn't happen. So that equity piece is really important. And it's already part of public health, but it's going to need to be a part of public policy a lot more generally.
Management and leadership.
It's going to come down to management and leadership. Knowing the right thing to do and then doing the right thing the right way.
And which probably is a good segue then to talk about communication, right?
My favorite topic, and your favorite topic. You actually do it for a living. I try to.
I think you do it better than I do sometimes.
No.
And I'll just read this question as it's written, because I think this is important. So, as with any complex situation, communication is critical. And we learned quite a bit about communicating scientific issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. That was something that you and I actually talked about a lot, not on camera, about how we explain something so complex and ever-changing with research that's constantly changing to people who are looking for some sense of certainty.
Yeah.
So what are the communication challenges that are already inherent with climate change? And what do you think the pandemic from COVID-19 could teach us about that?
Okay.
Sorry, that's a lot. Why don't
that's
we just
a lot.
start
Let's start with, so again, climate change is a scientific issue enveloped in a communications challenge wrapped into a leadership and management issue. And here's how I want to think about the communication challenge. I want everyone to go back and picture yourself on Easter Island in the mid-1600s, which is something that I know a lot of folks do a lot. So I'm not taking you a new place. Put yourself back on Easter Island in the mid-1600s. Now, folks may know that, at least according to some archaeologist renderings, one of the things that led to the downfall and the collapse of Easter Island society, one hypothesis, is that they cut down all the trees, and that the trees led to various other ecological challenges. The question, as I think about climate change communication, is as follows. What was the person who cut down the last tree on Easter Island saying when he cut down that tree? Was he saying, nah, it's going to be fine? Was he saying, you know what, there's going to be a technological solution? Or was he saying, you know, those tree people, they don't know what they're talking about, right? We're in a similar situation right now with respect to climate change. I don't want someone sitting in this auditorium 10, 100 years from now saying, what were people in Freeport, Maine saying in 2023 on the cusp of ecological downfall? I want us to get ahead of that problem now. And thinking about it in terms of what those Easter Islanders were saying on the cusp of cutting down that last tree is how I think about the communication issues around climate change. Now, COVID-19 produced a lot of useful ways to think about it. So let's think about climate in ways that are similar to COVID and then in ways that are distinct from COVID. On the similarity front, you touched on this, Chris. The similarity front, I think, has the unique thread of uncertainty. The ultimate impacts of climate change are uncertain, but that is misinterpreted as meaning we don't know. In the same way that the ultimate impact of COVID was uncertain and thus interpreted as those people don't even know. But it's not uncertainty per se, it's the fact that it's uncertain within a bound. Right. We know that this is the coldest summer we're ever gonna have. Maybe the hottest winter we're gonna ever have. That doesn't mean I know what the average daily temperature in 2072 is gonna be in Maine. So communicating uncertainty within this frame is very difficult. Okay. The second thing that is similar to COVID, and probably the one area where I feel like I could have done a much better job, is communicating the idea that what we know today will absolutely be different from what we know tomorrow, and that's a good thing. That's a sign of progress, right, not a sign of ambivalence or lack of knowledge. But this uncertainty spurs people to argue for non-action, which is ridiculous. You don't know if a tree is going to fall on your house. It's uncertain. But you still take action in the form of homeowners insurance, right? We need to use that same frame with respect to climate change. So that's what's the same. But there are a couple of areas in which climate change is different from COVID that are really important. The first is that climate change is distant. The second, it's downstream. Right. The third is that it's distinct, it's dissonant. And the fourth is that it's a lot of doom. Yeah. So let's talk about those. It's distant. What was the prevailing icon for climate change in the 1980s and 90s? By my lights, I'd say the polar bear, right? The polar bear was the icon for climate change. Right. Now, we are the icon for climate change. But the polar bear was distant. Right. And it was easy for people to say, yeah, it's all well and good, but hey, that's Santa's problem, not my problem. So that's a difference right there. Right. Climate change is distant. Now it's in our backyard, or in our front yard. So that's different. The other thing that's different with respect to COVID is that it's downstream. We're asking people to take action today to stave off disasters that may not come for 1, 5, 20, 50 years from now. It's intergenerational. The third is something I hinted at. It's a little bit dissonant to the way in which we live our lives. I'm talking about a problem, but then again, the solutions run contrary to the way that we all live our lives. Is anyone going to stop driving? Doubtful. Is anyone going to stop flying? Doubtful. Right. So how do you reconcile those two? It's very cognitively difficult. Right. And then the last thing that's difficult from a comms and distinct from a comms perspective is the doom element. If the prevailing narrative of climate change is that the fix is in and that doom is the only outcome, then why act? So I think it's critically important, as I hope I tried to do during COVID as well, to demonstrate that we have solutions. You know, a mantra that folks who worked with me at the Maine CDC know is that a problem without a solution is not a problem. It's just a bad fact, right? Yeah. And so we need to talk about climate change in terms of problems, but also solutions. You know, carbon emissions in the United States actually have gone down. Not enough, but they have come down. Only about 1% per year in the past decade and a half. But that's something. They ought to come down about 6% per year. But we're making progress. We're getting better at diagnostics, et cetera. So it's critical from a comms perspective to couple the challenge with potential solutions. I think if we follow that roadmap, we avoid the Easter Island problem. the problem of everyone just sitting on their hands saying nothing is possible, so too bad.
It's brilliant.
No. I'm just a guy who's on Twitter a lot.
I've now completely forgotten my next question for you. Tom, would it be okay if we take a couple of the written questions that have been submitted? Would that be okay? Because we're about like a good third of the way through. So
Great.
If we could, or about halfway or so. So if we have some of the written questions, I'd love to answer or get some of those addressed so that we don't lose them.
And Chris, while we're waiting, we can, if you want to open it up, we can.
Yeah, is there anybody who wants to, I'm going to have a hard time seeing you, but maybe somebody can help us out. Anybody who wants to raise their hand and ask a question? Right there, all the way in the back. Hi.
First of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for holding my hand through the COVID crisis. So you have covered a lot of ground. It's quite amazing, and it's a little bit hard to remember it all right now. So what I would like to ask is, if there is one thing that we could remember to take home from this, what would it be?
Okay, great. That is a fantastic question.
It's one of my favorites.
Yes. A great journalist question.
Exactly.
Yes. There's one thing. If there's one thing that I could ask you to take away from tonight, is to recognize that although we have a challenge on our hands, solutions are possible, and they require not just collective action, but they require strong management and strong leadership. That is, I think, something that has distinguished Maine and an approach that we should continue to follow. This challenge is not going to go away, but the surest way that we can both mitigate, adapt, and innovate is not by accident, but by deliberate, thoughtful prioritization, and all of that entails management and leadership.
One thing that occurred to me, so it kind of brought my question back. When you talk about communication and the difficulty of trying to convey the impact of climate change, do you feel that connecting it with public health will start to make inroads in getting people to start to think about it the right way?
I do, and it's not just me. There have been surveys and data and focus groups and various different communications approaches that have been studied to think about what resonates with respect to climate change, how to make the case in terms that will not just be easily understood, but then again, also galvanize people toward action, toward advocating for better management and for sound leadership. And what those studies have suggested is that although there are manifold impacts of climate change, we've talked about some of them, on our food supply, on our economic livelihood, on our infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Thinking about it and casting it in terms of our own health is an easy to understand shorthand for how to communicate about climate change. I don't even use the words public health.
Okay.
I just talk about climate change in our lives. Because all of us have seen, just in the past summer, the stunning increase in high heat, floods, and fires. All of us have seen that across the country. Some of that has been visited upon Maine. Some of that we've seen on TV. Our neighbors not too far over in Vermont grappled with really difficult floods over the summer. Our friends in Hawaii had devastating fires, to say nothing of the high heat events in Arizona, Houston, Louisiana. We've all seen those. And so we don't even have to use words like public health. We just have to talk about the ways in which climate change is affecting our lives now. Again, 30 years ago, polar bears were the icon. Today, we are the icons.
There's some themes kind of popping up in some of these questions that have to do with a potential for a vaccine for Lyme disease.
Yes.
I'm talking about preventatives for canines, and are there efforts underway right now to create one?
There are. So there used to be a vaccine for Lyme disease, and there is a vaccine for Lyme disease for dogs. Don't take that vaccine. Not approved for humans. Don't experiment that way, please. There is, but the vaccine we used to have for Lyme disease is not on the market anymore for a number of reasons, many of which are demand related, not safety related. Notwithstanding that, the scientists have gone back to the drawing board, to create a new and better vaccine for Lyme disease. And that vaccine for Lyme disease is currently in phase 3 trials right now. In fact, the CDC is planning an event, a public-facing event, I believe in March, we're looking at, to start getting feedback from the public about how we should start thinking about and evaluating any potential Lyme disease vaccine in the future. So there is research underway. The studies are being done literally as we speak right now, and the CDC is starting to think about how we will think about that vaccine once it's ready for our review. So hold tight. But all that said, and again, not to default to gloom, but just for awareness, Lyme disease is an important risk. It's the predominant risk from tick-borne diseases, but it's not the only one. There are other tick-borne diseases that are making their way through Maine. Diseases that go by names like anaplasma and babesia and a host of others. Those are also on the increase in Maine. And so while I'm excited about changes on the Lyme disease front, because that's the big dog, there are other diseases that we're still going to have to deal with. Now, there are skeptics of these vaccines and such, and we'll go through that process, but there is hope on that horizon.
And one of our reporters, Vivian Lee, has been really, really involved with covering Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses. And one thing that she's brought up a lot is that it is, in fact, climate change that is allowing the ticks to be more resilient through the winter. Some are surviving through winter. And then, help me understand, is it the virus that they carry inside of them is still alive?
Yes, so It's a couple of things. Let's first start by sort of an interesting methodological piece. One of the questions that comes up in climate change is how much of X phenomenon is driven by climate change, right? How much of the floods are driven by climate change? How much of the fires are driven by climate change? It's rarely zero. It's also rarely 100. Right. It's usually somewhere in between. And this is now an entire branch of science that's called attribution science, trying to use different types of data, models, et cetera, to attribute how much of X phenomenon is driven by climate change. Like, climate change doesn't necessarily cause an epidemic, but it can worsen an epidemic. It can intensify an epidemic. It can increase the frequency of them. So let's talk about how this all shakes out with Lyme disease. Some part of the increase of Lyme disease is driven by climate change. I mentioned a moment ago, though, another large part of it is just that there are more deer. And where there are more deer, there are more things that feed on deer, i.e. deer ticks. Mm-hmm. But all that said, the bug, the bacterium that causes Lyme disease can thrive in the larvae, in the young ticks. Those ticks are born earlier in the season because it's warmer and because the winters are not as harsh. They can, as soon as they're born, start looking for their so-called blood meals, which can often be on deer, but often be on humans. And when there's that interaction, going from deer to human and back, that's where they pass on the bug. So they come out earlier, they're hungry, there's more deer around, and there's more humans out there to get them, which they can feed on. Right. When you add all of those together, right, as well as some other factors, we're in more contact with ticks now because there's more folks out, things of that nature. The convergence of ticks and humans is greater. When all those factors conspire together, it's no surprise that Lyme disease cases have been exploding in Maine. Now, this phenomenon is not unique to Maine. This phenomenon of infectious diseases increasing because of, in part, climactic-driven factors is happening everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And this increase in infectious diseases comes down to a few interrelated factors. One is convergence. The human-animal border is blurring. It's convergence. The second is crowding. There are just a lot more humans, particularly in places like megacities. The third is not so much convergence or crowding, but just consilience. This is a fancy word for saying everyone is together a lot more often. And then, of course, the fourth factor is climate itself. So these factors, getting together more people, a blurred border between animals and humans, more humans going out into the wilderness in a lot of places in the world, sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, coming into contact with animals that they previously were shielded from, that phenomenon leads to these spillover events, which are usually the things that precipitate a chain of events that can lead to Ebola and Marburg, et cetera. And climate is inextricably linked to those events.
And not to belabor the point, so I try to move on, but you know, I feel like I remember talking about this in the context of Powassan virus.
Yes.
It being noticed further north, or
Exactly
farther
right.
north in Maine, simply because the ticks were able to survive because the climate has changed.
You know, a moment ago, Chris, I'm so glad you mentioned that. A moment ago I said Lyme disease, it's the big player, but there are a host of other diseases that can ride along either with ticks or with mosquitoes. Powassan virus is one such example. Powassan, recent phenomenon in Maine and now increasing. On the mosquito side, there are diseases like eastern equine encephalitis.
We've had
Again,
those so far this year. Yeah.
right, previously not a phenomenon, not a feature of the Maine summer, but now something that is increasingly found. Even in other parts of the United States, West Nile virus is on the march. During COVID, there was a terrible outbreak of West Nile virus in Arizona, over 100 deaths. It was eclipsed by COVID, but significant outbreaks. Sadly, we can expect to see more of those. That said, we're not powerless against those. We can all take steps to protect against ticks, mosquitoes, et cetera.
One theme that I'm kind of seeing here in some of the questions has to do with essentially preparing people for climate change and making things financially accessible.
Good.
Who should be bearing the increased cost of trying to prepare us for climate change?
Great. That's such a good question. It ties in very well with the leadership and management theme. These are fundamentally questions of leadership and management. There is no easy answer for who should bear the cost, because the honest answer is, in some way, shape, or form, all of us will bear different parts of the cost pie. Government certainly has a role to play. Indeed, just on Tuesday, President Biden announced significant expansions in funding, specifically for climate resilience issues, a hardier electric grid, things of that nature, as well as additional research funding. So certainly governments, both federal and at the state level, will have a role to play. The state of Maine's government is going to be no exception to that. Now is the time to start planning for these fiscal implications. Corporations and business community will also have a role to play. And so I don't mean to suggest that any one entity should shoulder the burden of this. It's again, simple solutions are usually neither. It's far too easy to say, oh, well, the government should pick up the tab, or we should just raise taxes on corporations. Those taxes will be ultimately borne by workers and all of us as consumers. So the answer will be multifaceted. And we won't go too many clicks into that. Maybe in another event we can talk about the economic aspects of climate change. But sufficient to say right now, it's not so much the answer that I want to focus on and leave you with. It's how we go about getting to that answer. And again, that fundamentally comes down to leadership and good management.
And I apologize if I've oversimplified some of your questions. We're just trying to keep a theme. So if I didn't get specifically to your question, I apologize.
Then blame Chris.
Yes, you can blame me. This was kind of unique and I thought very interesting. Given that plant-based diets are more sustainable, what can Maine do to support movement in that direction? I think we have a lot of interest in plant-based diets, and a lot of our agriculture economy relies on some of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm going to first acknowledge that it is the case. One of the drivers of climate change, as well as emissions of other greenhouse gases, methane in particular, is meat. But particularly, not all meat, but particularly large-scale industrial meat farming, feedlots, things of that nature. Okay. To say nothing of the international implications. Rainforests that are slashed in order to make room for expanding diets in countries that need more protein, et cetera. So what can Maine do, both on the plant-based side and then perhaps on the non-cattle, non-pig side? Well, I encourage folks to think about innovations of this nature. because this goes into that third category of innovations, in the following way. These products are being manufactured, meat or non-meat-based alternatives. Why can't they be made in Maine? Right? Solar panels are in high demand. Why can't they be made in Maine? A lot of the tools that will be needed to adapt to climate change, be they solar panels, better building materials that use recycled wood pulp, plant-based alternatives to common foods like meat-based foods. My question from a leadership and economic prosperity question or point of view is, why not in Maine? Or rather, what structures should we put into place now to lay the economic groundwork for those innovations and for those developments to happen in Maine? That is where I think we need to go. And as I think about the climate future in Maine, although it will have economic impacts, are there ways that Maine can carve out a niche so that we can simultaneously play a role on the supply chain and perhaps help mitigate some of those climate impacts? A plant-based diet, or rather the plants that would be needed to create those plant-based alternatives, or to have a bigger availability of fresh fruits and vegetables locally as well as internationally. Can those be grown in Maine? What can we start thinking about now to harness or seize upon trends that will invariably be coming our way as diets change as a result of climate change?
And it's something that just occurred to me as you speak about it is that even though we've joked about the age of our state,
I did. You did.
You twisted my words, Doctor.
I said nothing.
No, but
I love Mainers of all schools.
There's the economic side of that is we need people to move here to sustain our workforce and our economy, and those could be opportunities for that.
We're going to face these challenges irrespective of whether we like them or are ready for them. Again, no one likes the status quo, and no one's too keen on change either, right? So that's kind of the dilemma that we're in.
Yeah.
Right? Or to put it differently, everyone's great with change as long as nothing in their world is impacted.
Exactly.
And those luxuries are not luxuries we're going to have in the future. Again, irrespective of what you think about more businesses coming to Maine or more housing that's being needed, it's coming at us. It's coming at us one way or the other. We can plan and prepare and do so in an orderly, methodical manner, or we can react, which will be costlier and far more haphazard. Now is the opportunity and the time to think about these supply chain issues. We might get it wrong a little bit, right? That's okay. Solar panels may not be the thing that are in the highest demand 20 years from now. Maybe it will be wind turbines. Either way, all bets need to be on the table now so that we're not scrambling to catch up later.
This question, I think, is important because it touches very much on the communication, management, and leadership. And if you don't mind, I'm going to paraphrase this question. There was a lot of difficulty in the general public during the COVID-19 pandemic of trying to mentally adjust to the changes in the direction from the US CDC.
Yes.
And in many cases, it led to some distrust of the recommendations coming out of the US CDC. Why should people trust your agency to communicate to them on something like climate change as it relates to public health?
That is a $64,000 question. It's a great question. And to start it, we've got to acknowledge that although I'm very proud of the work that we did in Maine on the communications front, there were ways that we, as well as the US CDC, could have done a better job. And so regaining trust starts with acknowledging that we could have done things better and differently. And by my lights, one of the things that we could have done better, something I mentioned earlier, but it's worth diving into more, is setting the table on the ways in which scientific understanding of rapidly evolving events can and will change. Indeed, some climate scientists are stunned by how quickly some of the effects of climate change are being visited upon the US. Many climate scientists thought at some point floods, fires, heat waves would start. Many of them didn't realize it would be so soon. What we've got to do now is to set the table around climate change and the health impact in a manner that makes clear that what we know today will not be the same as what we know tomorrow, and that that is indeed a sign of maturity, that that's the science that you want. That's not a sign of weakness, it's not a sign of equivocation, it's not a sign of scientists not knowing what's going on. That is, by my lights, a way to engender more trust.
Right.
I'm proud of the way that we approached it in Maine. We tried not to speak in definitives. We tried not to overpromise. We tried to tell you what we knew, when we knew it, and what we were doing to try to find answers. Right. Climate is no different in that respect. I don't want to sit before you and say that I've got all the answers. Right. Not even close. No one does. What I want to talk about, though, is how we get to those answers collectively, and hence the focus on things like management and leadership. But all of that is predicated on trust. And the other lesson from COVID, I referenced this somewhat jokingly earlier, but it's true. You don't want to be exchanging business cards in a crisis. You don't want to be introducing yourself in a crisis. Now is the time for government officials, elected leaders of all stripes, to start getting a bank account filled with trust. Because when the climate crises start in Maine, they're going to need that trust. They're going to need to take time now to build up the trust. So when that crisis hits, people already have that trust in place so that they can then be trusted to take action. Now, skeptics will always cast doubt on this. A lot of people think that climate change is a bunch of hot air. I mean, I guess it is. Think about it. Kind of is a lot of hot air. But there will be naysayers. Yeah. Now is the time to have that conversation rather than in the midst of the crisis.
And I feel like I remember a discussion that, maybe never made it to television between you and I, but that, yeah, the science around something that we are learning about as it develops, the science changes, the recommendations change, and that rigidity in the recommendations would be irresponsible.
It would be. I mean, if the science changes, and we hew to guidelines from last week, that's not doing the best for people. And so we've got an obligation on our end, not just to communicate when things change, but again, to set in advance that what we know will change. And with respect to climate change and health, to start talking about now how the future may have a lot of unknowns with it, but that's not a reason for inaction. And that's one reason I want to talk with everyone tonight, is to start laying that groundwork, to acclimatize people to the notion that there's going to be a lot of change coming our way. And so, Chris, I actually want to take a minute to turn a question to you, which is how are you and your colleagues in the media thinking about covering these issues as they start becoming more real and more pressing? Like obviously framing it in terms of a story is critical so that we can all see ourselves in it. But how are you thinking about this? I didn't prep that for Chris, but it's just been on my mind.
That's okay.
So
I think one of the biggest challenges is that we have something that is, as you've mentioned, so complex, has so many different tentacles, so to speak, and is also can be very dense and scientific and complex. And for many of us who don't have a science background, then trying to then explain it to somebody else. I mean, my job is basically to become an expert on whatever I'm covering in a matter of hours. And luckily for COVID, I had days and weeks and months where I'm like, okay, I know how this works now, so I can kind of build that institutional knowledge. With climate change, we're kind of having to do the same thing of, okay, what topics do we know aren't changing from story to story, that we build that institutional knowledge that we can then pass on to everybody else and say, look, these are the things we've researched over and over and over again. We've heard from innumerable experts that this is a theme, this is a trend, so you need to know about it. And then we try to put that framed in a story of a way that makes everybody kind of connect with it, so that it feels like, oh wait, this is something that affects me. It's not just this person in Westbrook or this person in Rumford or this person in Kittery. It affects me no matter where I live. That's kind of always been our goal.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I will ask you this because I think this is interesting. You talked about what keeps you awake at night.
Yeah, everything. Everything.
How do you take care of your mental health?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And how's it looking right now?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Let me first acknowledge that everyone in Maine has had a tough go lately. So this is a question that we should all ask ourselves, not just Chris asking me. The second is that I think it's also important to note that although my job is tough, all of our jobs are tough. And I'm so incredibly lucky to have a wife, my wife who's here with me this evening, right there, who's always by my side. Thank you, honey. Many of you have heard Kara and I on stage. And also space to make sure that I am doing just as you said, to make sure that thinking about not just the problem in front of me, but how I'm going to be ready and sharp for the problems 5, 10 years from now. That's why we come back home, right? Why we love it here. Yeah. And part of the way in which I do that is we come back here and we hike and we go walking and we drink beer and all the things that give me a lot of solace.
So you got me on one.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is coming to Maine is critical. I mean, Maine brings out the best in me. And so part of what motivates me is to try to bring out the best in Maine. And that's one reason working on these issues is so critical. We've got an opportunity in Maine as it relates to these climate change issues to really get ahead of it. Because it's other states right now that are getting hit predominantly. We've got a window in which we can get ahead of these things, as I said, to plan and prepare now rather than before the disaster. And so one of the things that motivates me is to do just that. I want to give back to Maine as much as Maine has given me.
I'm going to go off script and just say that if anybody is struggling right now, I just kind of came out the other side of some tough stuff. And I will say that the recent events at the end of October were kind of like the piano that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
Like I was already kind of carrying a load of straw around, and that was tough. And there are a ton of really incredible resources in our state that are then being developed. One of them is a crisis receiving center where, I'm going to bear it all out, I went there and I talked to a crisis counselor about what I was going through.
Good for you, Chris. That's great. That's great.
That was not my point. Well, my point was not to make you clap for me. My point was to let you know that like this affects everybody, even the people who sit on TV every day and smile and crack jokes with Keith Carson. That like we are all dealing with it in one way or another, and I hope that everybody feels comfortable with everything that's going on in the world, feeling like they can reach out to somebody, or at least knowing that they have one person that they can say, hey, I'm really struggling with this right now. Can I talk to you?
Yeah.
It's not a judgment. It's
fantastic. Chris, I got to say, you kept me and my family informed for what seemed like 96 continuous hours on the air, or even more, 120 continuous hours on the air. So I wanted to thank you for being on the forefront. Watching was difficult enough. I can't imagine what it was like for you to both cover it and process at the same time.
It was a lot. And we'll have that discussion another time. I think.
Yeah.
You know what? But I'll end this portion of it with this by just saying, people asked me a lot, like how I was doing, and my response to them, to every single person, was the same: that I felt like this was very difficult, and it was not my turn to be sad, because on Halloween, I didn't have to work. I got to go home and hang out with my wife and my kid while she chose what candy to pass out to the trick-or-treaters.
Yeah.
No, you get the Whoppers. I get the Reese's.
Yeah.
But I got to do that.
Yeah.
I didn't have my favorite places, my favorite people taken away from me in the blink of an eye with no control. So yes,
Well,
it hurts. Yes, it's hard to process,
it
but
is.
it wasn't the same for me as it was for everybody.
Well, I mean, and here we are doing this on stage, but it's important. And you know, earlier you were asking me, and just now, in connection with that last question, how I'm doing, or how we're doing, and that question has come up, I'm sure, for both of us in recent weeks, recent years. And it's interesting because when that question is put to me, my reaction is always the same, which is, it's not about me. In light of current events, it's about dozens of people and family members who are grieving an immeasurable loss. During COVID, it was about the thousands of people who didn't know if their loved one was well or not. And so, as hard as this is, it's important to remember that we're all in this together. And even though we had challenges, there are so many folks who are going through so much. So yeah, thank you for reflecting with me on
And
that.
thanks for letting us go there.
Yeah.
What do you say we end on a funny note?
All right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Just so we're all aware, this was written at the top, it says, final question.
Okay.
So this person has read the room.
Yeah.
What was your reaction when you learned that Wilbur's of Freeport was going to put your face on chocolate bars?
Oh boy. Okay. Okay. Who remembers the TV show? Many of you were very, very young during this. Who remembers the TV show Candid Camera? Yeah. So we were in our office, and Robert Long and my former assistant Peggy came into my office and said, "Hey, Wilbur's wants to put your face on a candy bar." And I immediately looked around for a camera hidden somewhere. Because that was their sense of humor. It's certainly my sense of humor. And they said, "Hey, no, we're serious." And I said, "That's very gratifying. It's very honorable, but the answer is no." And the reason I said that was that, how do I put this without, it's worrying, because at that stage in the pandemic in particular, there is a certain segment of the population that loves nothing more than to build somebody up only to take them down, right? You wonder why we have difficulty recruiting leaders who want to serve, right? And so I was quite hesitant to go that direction. And so I initially conveyed a thanks but no thanks. Turns out I don't have the right to do that. Because at the time I was already a public figure, and public figures can't copyright their image. So I actually had no basis on which to say, I appreciate the gratitude, but pass. So then the conversation was, well, are there ways to turn this thing into something for good? Not just for candy, which I am entirely supportive of, but for good. And the amazing folks at Wilbur's said, yeah, how about we slice off a portion of the proceeds to support a food bank? And we said, well, that is a brilliant idea. And so my initial reaction was a bit of shame, or a bit of disbelief, then a bit of fear, a bit of denial, and then a bit of, hey, how can we make this work for Mainers? And that's what we did.
Nice.
That's what we did.
Doctor, we have reached the end of the...
10 minutes left.
I was just going to say.
Questions from the audience?
That's
Yeah,
what I
let's
was
do
hoping
some
we could
questions
do
from the
now.
audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you guys... Oh, there you go. Right here. Do we have a microphone for you? Yeah. You want to just raise your hand so they can bring that microphone to you?
Oh, yes, sir.
There
Okay.
you go.
So this is a leadership management question. How do we change the mindset, that climate change might be overstated, of possible future governmental administrations who may reverse environmental regulations?
Yes, sir. That's a very good question. Very good question. And the change in the mindset. So here, let me talk a bit about how not to do that, and then some ideas for how to do it. A lot of persuasive communication, whether it's for vaccines or for climate change, is predicated on one of two ideas. One idea is a knowledge deficit. If only they knew what I knew, then they would see the world the way I do. Probably not right. The other is a high school debate model. If I just blow all of their counter-arguments out of the park, then they will invariably see the world my way. Both of those approaches usually lead to more retrenchment on the other side rather than persuasion on anything. So, ways not to do it. Don't treat it like a high school debate. Don't treat it like simply a knowledge deficit. By my lights, the way to bring folks on board who may not see the world in the same way right now is to personalize the stories, to make them relatable, to make them narrative-driven. I didn't do that tonight, but it's certainly how when I'm chatting with folks in DC, to tell stories that are germane to their own jurisdictions, so we can put a face on it. Again, I said we are the icons of climate change now. But then also to couple those narratives with potential solutions. A gloom and doom approach is just as deleterious as a head in the sand approach. And so using solutions, pointing out where things are possible, where progress has been made, coupled with personalizing the narrative, is, for me, the strategy for any type of persuasive communication, climate change, vaccines, or otherwise. And then an occasional lame joke. But that, for me, is a superior method to bringing along even the staunchest naysayers. So I very much appreciate your question. It's something I have given a lot of thought to, and so thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on it.
And I'll just add to that, the two themes that I took away from his response, solutions-based and personalizing the narrative, are the two things that we're trying to do as we communicate the issues to the greater public. There's a question over here and right there.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth McClellan, and I'm the founder of Partners for World Health. First of all,
How are you?
hi. Thank you. First of all, I want to say that we are sad that you left Maine, but we are so proud that you were at the CDC from Maine. So congratulations on your position. So I recently was traveling in Bangladesh providing primary healthcare services to Dhaka City, which is in a country of 175 million people, the size of the state of Iowa. In the largest slum there in Dhaka, 250,000 people, on a river, we have incredible pollution with garbage and trash. There is incredible air pollution. And so I'm wondering, is it our responsibility, or what is our responsibility to help with climate change in the world?
That is such a good question. I'm going to, so first of all, my answer is yes, that we do have some degree of responsibility to assist with the adaptation and mitigation. I'm going to reframe your question to what is, by my lights, the most important question facing society, world, Maine, that we all need to answer. And that question is as philosophical as it is practical. And that is, what do we owe to each other? And in some sense, it's easy to localize that question, as I just suggested to the gentleman earlier. But doing so neglects to account for the significant humanitarian as well as pragmatic risks that emanate from other parts of the world. So by my lights, we have both a humanitarian interest as well as, I'll be honest, a self-interest in helping to mitigate the threats of climate change in places like Bangladesh, sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. Part of it is just, again, through the innumerable human toll. The cyclones that regularly hit Bangladesh with increasing ferocity lead to countless numbers of lives lost. And the US government, CDC, USAID, et cetera, are playing a role there. But more equally relevant is the self-interest there. One of the diseases that keeps me up at night is a nasty virus called Nipah virus. And it is emerging in Bangladesh through an unholy alliance between humans and bats and their droppings. Much of that is driven by, again, this convergence between animals and bats, humans and bats. We've got an interest there. CDC is on the ground there to contend with those issues, to try to help keep Nipah virus far away. Doesn't mean it's any better when it's far away, it's still bad. But it's in our both humanitarian interest to make, as well as our own national security interest, to help countries make sure they're staying on top of these things, without a doubt.
One right here.
Sorry.
I'm going to invoke my privilege here. There was a gentleman who's in the audience, I believe, and I commented on the shirt he was wearing tonight, Would that gentleman please stand? Thank you. Would you tell us what your shirt says, please?
Dr. Nirav Shah, we trust.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And Dr. Nirav Shah, we trust. And I
Thank
just
you.
have to say that I'm one of those people that day in and day out in the early days of the pandemic were glued to the television, and I was just enamored by the way that you were able to communicate to us and make us feel safe. So thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It was an honor. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Nirav. Thank you all. We look forward to seeing you in 2024. And good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Yeah.
You're a man.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank
That
you.
was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I really
Heidi
appreciate it.
Heidi was going to get in her thing.